Well, hi, I'm Dr. Jonathan Hoover, and we're in a sermon series right now at New Spring called Desperado, How to Love Someone Who's Lost Their Way. And I have several questions that have come in through social media. One of them is, if my spouse is a Christian but has wandered from God's will, should I stay with him for the kids? First thing I want to say is I totally sympathize with what you're going through. That it's got to be very difficult to love someone very much and to see them making bad choices. One thing that I think is apparent from your question is that you recognize that it is a healthy thing for families to stay together if they can, and it does benefit the kids. Judith Wallerstein wrote a book called What About the Kids? It is very interesting when you look at her research that it does impact kids, maybe even more than we think, when families break up. But I will say this. The scriptural reason for trying to stay together, if you can, if your spouse is wandering away from God, has not necessarily, it's not, the point is not necessarily for the kids. The point that's made when Paul wrote to the church at Corinth is that your godly influence is still a powerful influence in that person's life. And you may actually make a huge difference in that person's life by modeling God's love for them. And so I would say that really the pivotal question here is whether that person who is sort of wandering away from God's will is being destructive, right? If they're being emotionally destructive or if they're being abusive in some way, at that point, then I think, especially when there's abuse involved, I think often a separation is really necessary. For there to be an opportunity for trust to be regained and for perhaps, a change of course to be made for that person to really demonstrate repentance if that's in their heart to do so. It's always important if you're in an abusive situation to get to safe ground, which often means that there has to be a season of separation, and sometimes divorce follows that. But I do think if a person is not being emotionally destructive, if they're not being abusive, if they're not if they're not cheating, I think that the biblical answer is that it's really good to stay with that person. So if it's a safe relationship, let me put it that way. If it's a safe relationship, but there's just a concern that this person is not following God the way they should, then I think the biblical imperative is to stay together and not to necessarily try to force them to see the light, quote unquote, but rather to live out God's love with them and to remember that your influence in their lives in their life is very powerful. So I hope that's helpful answering the question, if my spouse has wandered away from God, should I stay with them for the kids?